for being with us today, and we're going to get into our first session here now. And so it is my privilege to welcome today as our keynote speaker, Ryan Panzer. So I'm going to say a few things about Ryan before he gets going. Ryan is the author of Grace and Gigabytes, this handy dandy book right here. I'll pause for a second to just plug this book. If you're going to read one book on digital ministry in the church, I would highly recommend that it be Grace and Gigabytes. It talks a lot about culture, and even if you're not engaged in digital ministry at all, digital technology is forming and shaping your world and the world of the people whom you serve. And one of my favorite parts of this book is the little, he's got little sections where he offers suggestions for hybrid ministry. And so he's got high-tech suggestions for those of us who may be a little bit more comfortable with digital technology, low tech for maybe those people who are just entering into this kind of work, and then no tech for the Luddites among us. So it's a great book, and I highly recommend it. So Ryan is the author of Grace and Gigabytes, Being Church in a Tech-Shaped Culture, and The Holy and the Hybrid, Navigating the Church's Digital Reformation. Ryan has spent his career in the worlds of church leadership and technology. He received his MA from Luther Seminary while simultaneously working for Google. Ryan serves as a learning and leadership development professional in the technology industry and as a speaker and writer on digital technology in the church. Ryan also serves as the resident theologian at Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Madison, Wisconsin, where he lives with his wife and 2 children. And I will share his website where you can go and find out more things about Ryan. And I have to say, I'm so honored that he's here. I'm surprised he's not dressed in black today, because his beloved Milwaukee Bucks just got eliminated from the NBA playoffs. So we'll all say a little prayer for Ryan today, that he can work through the grief and loss that he's experiencing today, and share some of his expertise with us. Thank you so much, Ryan, for being here with us today.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Rob, and great to see all of you this morning. Maybe it's a good thing the Bucks lost, because it means I won't have to stay up too late watching basketball anymore for the duration of the postseason, and that's okay. Great to see all of you today, and thank you for tuning in this morning for this conversation on dispatches from the digital frontier and what comes next for the church's digital ministry moment. Now, as Rob mentioned, I have a master's degree from Luther Seminary. My background is Lutheran, but when I speak with groups that have a wide array of participants from different backgrounds, and particularly from the Anglican tradition, I always like to share that I was baptized into the Anglican Church some years ago. This is St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And when if you ever pick up the Holy and the Hybrid, you'll recognize that there's a Episcopal Church that is kind of at the center of that book. This is St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Waupaca, Wisconsin, which is where I found myself on Friday, March 13th, 2020. And on that afternoon, we were there for my grandmother's funeral, for her memorial service. And she had passed away at an old age and had lived a wonderful, faithful, remarkable life. It was so integral in bringing me to a life of faith and participation in a church community. And I attended worship with her so many times at this church. But as I talked to the rector of the church before the funeral, and he was thinking about plans for virtual worship for the first time on Sunday, March 15th, and what that was going to look like, and how he hardly had a Wi-Fi connection in the building. There wasn't anything more than a laptop some 10 years old within the building. And just the number of challenges that this congregation in Waupaca, Wisconsin was going to face, I couldn't help but thinking the question of, if we're going to do digital ministry, how can we think about digital ministry in such a way that brings folks like my grandma, age 83, but still an Instagram user who had an iPhone, who used Bluetooth speakers, to connect with church homes like St. Mark's, which are low tech, low Wi-Fi, low bandwidth, in such a way that creates and uplifts community, even in moments where we may not feel like we have the resources to do digital ministry at an exceptionally high level. So I always like to start with that, because this work of digital ministry is not just about convincing congregations and churches to do all things digitally in all times and all places, but is always an exploration into real lives, encountering real churches that work through real challenges of resources and staffing, and how we can make this work both feasible and sustainable. As we go through our session today, you're going to hear me talk a fair bit about this concept of hybrid ministry. And one thing I want to stress about hybrid ministry is this is not a process of convincing anyone to show up at your church, particularly young people. And when we think about hybrid and digital ministry, oftentimes the first thought is, well, this is going to be a great way to get young families, young people, Gen Z and millennials to just show up at our churches. And I think if we do that, we're destined for frustration. Rather, I think this is instead an exploration of putting two sometimes conflicting and sometimes harmonious attributes of church community into dialogue with one another, which is the digital and analog nature that the church has taken up. And considering when you have digital and analog space together, how might we find ways to encounter Christ and to walk in the life of faith in a way that now spans across virtual and physical spaces? You're also going to hear me talking today about the digital Reformation. Of course, being from the Lutheran tradition, this is something that is usually top of mind for me. And a couple of things I want to stress about the digital Reformation is when we think about what is being remade here, what we're thinking about is really not a shift away from neighborhood geographic-based ministry. Rather, it's a revitalization of a model of church we've always known. And here I think Elizabeth Drescher, who's written a number of excellent books, among them Tweet If You Heart Jesus, where she first coined this term, digital Reformation, talks about that this is a revitalization of the church driven by the often ad hoc spiritualities of ordinary believers as they integrate practices of access, connection, participating, creativity, and collaboration into the life of faith. When we think about digital and hybrid ministry, then we're not thinking about how to move church online. We're not talking about how to take our sanctuaries or our face-to-face encounters out of the picture. Rather, we're seeking to think about the ways the world and culture around us have changed, the way that digital is acting on our culture and changing the way we think and believe and come to faith, and considering the ways that we might combine the digital with the analog so that Christ might be encountered. And hopefully today will be a successful session. Some of the things I'll be looking for, and perhaps these will be useful to you as well, is first of all, if we can define what the purpose of this is in a post-pandemic church. 3 years ago, it was obvious what the purpose of digital ministry was, because most of our parishes, it was all we had. But that purpose has changed in the last 3 years. So we'll get into that. I also want to do a little bit of comparing and contrasting of some different models of digital ministry, looking at all online, all offline, and everything in between, and what those models have to say, both about how we organize our churches and what the theological commitments of our ministry models might be. And finally, if you have a moment, perhaps in breakouts, to think about what the purpose of hybrid or digital is in your specific ministry context, then I think this Saturday morning will be time well spent. The way we'll structure our time together is we'll have 3 different sections. Part one, we're going to go through some of the state of digital, what's happening in this somewhat post-pandemic moment of the church. I say somewhat post-pandemic because my family and I just got over a bout with COVID where it swept through our house fast and furious. So I hesitate to use post-pandemic too broadly. Second, part 2, we're going to think about these different models of ministry and which one makes perhaps the most sense given your mission and vision in a particular context. And then in part 3, we're going to talk about strategies for digital content, which I'm going to talk about as being key to extending an invitation to the life of a ministry. We're specifically in that section going to talk about the differences between creating content and curating content, and what the differences between those two things are, and how we might consider them in a Christian context. And then just a little bit about my background. I consider myself someone who stands at this intersection of church and technology. Do some learning and development work in the tech industry. I've also served in various congregations, including Good Shepherd Lutheran, which is my home church and where I'm on part-time staff now, currently conducting an experiment about how we can extend the themes of the preaching and the liturgy from one Sunday and continue the conversation through digital content Monday through Saturday. We'll share more about that experiment a little later on. Before we get into the content of the day, then I'd like to turn us into our first breakout. And I will post this question in the chat. In breakouts, what's something you've learned about digital ministry since 2020? What is one thing that has surprised you about digital or hybrid ministry? And what's one challenge that you are working through right now? So something you've learned, something that's surprised you, and something that is that has been a challenge for you. Just having a hard time copying and pasting, so if you'll bear with me for one moment. Okay, I think that did it. And so Rob, would you mind keying up our first breakout, and why don't we take 5 to 6 minutes for this first discussion. Welcome back from breakouts. Would love to hear at this point if you have anything for the breakouts you'd like to share, other including a learning, a challenge, or a surprise on digital ministry.
So for me, I think what surprised me the most was, like, when COVID hit right away, I don't think our church went on digital, but probably towards that Christmas was when we completely got our proper service on. And for that service, we had about 90 people watching us, that Christmas service. And I mean, that was a pretty big surprise for us.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, we continued having our services online, and we had a constant amount of people joining in. And another big thing was, I was very surprised, as our congregation at the church that I was at that point was everybody was above the age of, let's say, 65 and above kind of congregation. And it was amazing how people adjusted to the new technology. Like, they were getting tabs, they were getting laptops, and they did have a little bit of struggle setting it up, but we were willing to help them. And they were just so on board in such a short period of time. And they were willing to learn, which I thought was exceptional.
Thanks so much for sharing, Anne. I think that the willingness to learn was so evident in the church in 2020 and through today. I don't think any institution adapted so rapidly as the church in 2020.
I mean, like, one of the best example was, like, we had a couple, they were, at that point, they must have been like 90, 92, 93, around that age. And they were like, we are already just got to get on Facebook. So we drop by at their house. What do we do with it? So just help them log in and all that. And they were watching the service. It was so nice.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Gail, did I see your hand raised?
You did. So I was surprised how many people adapted. A lot of our congregation is seniors. And the thing that really, really shocked me was we have a number of students that come from MUN to our church. And a lot of them graduated and they went back home to their home countries, Mexico. And we had people from all over the world watching our service. And our numbers go anywhere from 75 to 150 a week. And I'm saying, look at how many people want God in their lives. And that is so encouraging. And if this is the way we got to do it, this is the way we got to do it. And we can't be afraid of it. A lot of people are afraid. We can't be afraid of it. We have to embrace it.
Thanks, Gail. Would anyone else care to share either a learning surprise or a challenge?
I'll share if it's
Thanks,
okay.
Glenn.
Yeah, for in our group, like a lot of we talked about, most of the people in our group are in Newfoundland, or in, like, especially parts like Newfoundland where are more isolated. Internet is not as, the access to internet is not as easy to access. Access the access. Anyway, I mentioned too in my church how it was a challenge because there was an older building. Adapting the internet to our building was difficult, and actually, as I also noted, we don't have internet in our church. It's a Presbyterian church here in St. John's, St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. We had to get our internet from the hall next door transferred over, so that was another challenge. Leanne, is there anything you'd like to add to that? Like, you're in Montreal, so you probably have a bit different, of course, than we have in Newfoundland.
Well, like I said, I will be sharing some of those things, so I will leave that. I think we should leave with what you said, Glenn. Thank you.
Sorry.
Just to respond real quickly to Glenn's comments, when we have a low bandwidth congregation, or you're in an area with limited internet access, that's where I think it's useful to think not only about live streaming. Video streaming is an extremely high bandwidth activity, both to upload the stream and also to download or to view it. Sharing content on social media or through an email newsletter is a very low bandwidth activity. So when we think about the section later this morning on content creation and curation, we can think about those as models for digital ministry. A live stream, a video live stream, does not necessarily need to be part of a digital ministry practice. So we will explore all of that later to come. Well, thanks everyone. We'll have a few more breakouts as we go through our morning. But now I'd like to spend some time talking about the state of digital ministry and where we find ourselves. So to understand where we are today, it's helpful to understand where we were 3 years ago. 3 years ago at this time, usage of internet, particularly social media and streaming applications, catapulted to previously unseen heights and led many to believe that our participation in digital communities had permanently solidified at a high level and would never revert to its previous norms. In a piece called "The Virus Changed the Way We Internet," the New York Times identified that there had been a 27% surge in Facebook usage, 16% increase in Netflix usage, and 15% increase in the usage of YouTube. Now, at that particular moment, the church had some catching up to do. So if we look pre-pandemic, estimates on this data vary depending on what sources you consult. But when you look at sources that don't pull exclusively from evangelical Protestant communities, so they have a wider sampling size, as many as half of churches didn't have a website. As many of a third of congregations didn't have a Wi-Fi connection, and as many as half of churches didn't use social media. So right away from the start of the pandemic, the church had some, you could say, catching up to do, or at least some exploration as to how we could meet the demands of the social distance moment. At that particular moment too, there had also been a leveling off, if not a stagnation, in cultural interest in what the church was all about. And we know this because when we look at a tool called Google Trends, which is kind of a fun barometer of cultural interest, trends.google.com, you can type in any phrase and it'll show you, is that term increasing, decreasing, or staying the same in terms of searches on Google's engine. When we look at church, there had been a slight decline in the number of searches for churches going back from 2004 to the present. So 15 years of data, fewer people looking for church than there was 15 years previous. Then all of a sudden, COVID hit, and you saw a fourfold increase in the number of searches for church online. So if we put ourselves back 3 years ago, we found ourselves in this situation where suddenly the church, many of whom didn't have Wi-Fi, many of whom didn't have social media, were in this culture that was fixed at this level of internet usage, even consumption, and in a moment where our culture was increasingly interested in accessing digital forms of church community. That's why the early returns from digital church were quite glowing, optimistic, and frankly exciting. The Barna Group tells us that almost every single pastor was involved with some kind of a live stream or recorded worship service in 2020. That 50% of churches saw their attendance increase during the early days of COVID. And what I think is the most interesting metric from this slide is that 11% of religious nones, or those who check the not affiliated box on census type surveys, felt their religious faith strengthened as a result of these practices of prayer and scripture reading and worship suddenly becoming more accessible in digital spaces. So really, when we think about that moment, it was an exciting one on the trajectory in the story of digital ministry. This was why when you saw cultural influencers into the church like Nadia Bowles-Weber, she would bring together thousands for prayer services on her Instagram live page. This one was from November 2020, 6,314 Instagram users tuned into her 15-minute prayer service on Instagram. Even those outside of church leadership rosters were getting in on this trend. Brene Brown, who is not a rostered leader or a member of the clergy, but is a best-selling author and a very famous research psychologist and an Episcopalian, posted some 15-minute candlelight services on her Instagram pages during the early days of the pandemic, generating some 36,000 views on average. So this was this moment where not only were people connecting to churches, but were interested in the story that the church was telling and finding it in new and creative ways. Now, all of that was very exciting until it became evident that doing digital ministry was just a little bit of work for those of us in the church. And it involved these things: some worship planning with the music team, writing the sermon, creating events on YouTube, scheduling volunteers to record services, posting invites to online worship, linking online worship in newsletters, confirming your video volunteers showed up, confirming they know what they were doing, starting your service, greeting those gathered online and offline, preaching your sermon, counting the number of online viewers, reviewing the video and audio quality, holding a training session when it turns out that video quality wasn't good, finding out your video volunteer isn't available next week, finding another volunteer for next Sunday, and repeating that process, but only every Sunday for the rest of your ministry career. When the reality of digital ministry set in, it became clear that this was going to be a process of continued refinement and discernment. Because even though the culture had found itself in a moment where there was increased interest in the story that the church was telling in digital spaces, there was also this reality that we would have to find a way to do it sustainably in a way that's compatible with resourcing, but most importantly, mission and vision. Now, around this time, the Pew Research Center did a number of surveys and polls about online worship. And one of the most revealing findings that they published during this time was that when they surveyed those who regularly attend worship services 2 or more times per month, only 13% of them said that they planned to attend online worship as their primary form of church attendance after the pandemic or after the lockdowns were over. So about 1 in 10 were worshiping online during COVID and said they would continue to do so as their primary form of church attendance. The majority of this audience said that they would either move back to fully in-person church or do what my family does on a Sunday morning, which is see how wild our kids are and make a call as to whether we want to worship from the living room or put them into the sanctuary where they can run up and down the aisles. That's why when you look at this Google Trends data, it was somewhat unsurprising that this church online trend was more of an anomaly than a continuation. And the number of searches for church online went back not quite to where it was before the pandemic, but certainly well below where it was in March and April of 2020. And that's why when you look at digital church attendance today, it's somewhat of a mixed picture. There are some churches that are still finding that their attendance is quite strong, that they're seeing more attendance and involvement online than they were at the start of the pandemic, or even more so online than in person. But in the limited snapshot I have of churches that I work with, I find that in some cases, the churches are now seeing about 25% of the worship attendance online than what they saw during the early days of the pandemic. So here's Good Shepherd Lutheran, where I'm on part-time staff, and you'll see we averaged just over 120 views during the height of COVID, and now we're seeing about 30. And when we look at another church here in Madison, they were averaging 500 views per week on their Sunday services. They're now at about 50. That doesn't mean that trend is true of everyone, but this seems to be a somewhat consistent story with groups I talk to, that online worship attendance has faded as more people have returned to the sanctuary. What's curious about that story, though, is that digital church has faded in quantity, but perhaps not in importance. The Barna Group has a number of data points from its 2022 study called The New Sunday. And they found a couple of things. First of all, when you look at the start of the pandemic compared to now, millennials are attending church more frequently than they were in 2020. So in 2020, you had about 1 in 5 millennials attending church weekly. Today, that number is actually just below 40%. Only the baby boomer generation is attending church less frequently than they were at the start of the pandemic. And my wife and I have had conversations about this where we're wondering where all of our friends' parents have gone. Our friends are still, the friends who are our age are back in the building on Sunday morning. We're not sure where their parents have gone, who we've been accustomed to seeing in our church communities. When we think about then how millennials and Gen Z and these younger generations are looking to encounter or participate in worship, it's this blend of online and offline that really captures the story. Fewer than 25% of millennials, or less than 25% of millennials, are worshiping exclusively online, but 53% of millennials are worshiping online and offline in some combination. I suspect many of them are young parents with huge piles of laundry to do on Sunday mornings. So they're making that decision when they first wake up about what's going to be right for their schedule. And this is a trend that also holds true of Gen X, and is mostly true of all church adults, that blend of online and in person represents where they feel today. Perhaps the other trend that is so important to this moment is the idea of the digital church hopper. When you look at Christians or active churchgoers, most are attending the same church as before the COVID-19 pandemic, but many are attending either multiple churches, or they're attending their home church and occasionally worshiping digitally with another, or viewing sermons from another congregation, or digital content through another congregation. This idea of digital church hopping is only getting started, and I think it's going to have some profound ripple effects on what it means to be church communities, some good and perhaps some that may be unsettling. But the reality is, 30% of all Christians are worshiping at congregations other than their own. On the one hand, this is exciting because it perhaps boosts our attendance, it gets our messages out to more people, to more viewers, to more worshipers. On the other hand, this presents a couple of challenges, both from the fact that it perhaps makes it more difficult to cultivate intentional forms of community and intentional conversations. And it perhaps puts a little bit of pressure on today's church leader. And maybe you see this best through the rise of TikTok, which was one of the more remarkable technology stories of the pandemic. Today's average TikTok user is spending over 25 hours a month consuming short form entertaining videos on TikTok. And TikTok is a social media network that is perhaps only defined through the idea of short form entertainment, access through an algorithmic feed. There's very few conversations that happen on TikTok. It's an entertainment and consumption platform. The challenge of where digital technology is heading, even setting the whole AI conversation aside for a moment, is the challenge of the rise of the digital as being an experience of primarily entertainment. And I think all of us maybe would be good here to consider how the church is not called to be entertainers, but the church is called to proclaim a gospel that in many cases is anything but entertaining. So let me pause there. There are a number of questions in the chat. Rob, any particular questions or comments you want to lift up here? I'm going to scroll through these myself.
Well, there was the one question there from Jody about what is the age division of millennial, Gen X, and Boomer? Are these the only three existing today? Don did share a link there, but I don't know if you wanted to speak to that. Just because there's really no consensus on how these cohorts, generational cohorts, are kind of divided. But like when you use those terms, how do you use them? So like Boomer, Gen X, and Millennial.
Yeah, typically, I mean, when I consider millennial, I consider anyone who was born in the 80s, baby boomer generation, typically anything post World War II leading up to the mid to late 60s. And then Generation Z, anyone born close to the year 2000. So this website that's linked in the chat lists 1997. That seems to be about right. When we think about generational cohorts, I think the most important thing to realize is that millennials are quite a bit older than we imagine. A lot of millennials are in their early to mid 40s now. So when you think about millennials, these aren't kids who are running around college campuses. They're adults who are trying to figure out how to raise families and still get to church on time on Sunday morning. So yeah, great question, Jody. Thank you for asking, and thank you, Don, for posting that link.
Yeah, and I guess the newest cohort is the Gen Zs. They would be the youngest.
Yeah, Gen Z is our, and when we think about Gen Z, so those born after 1997, I think about a Gen Z, probably your oldest Gen Z is going to be in their early 20s, 23, 24 years old right now. This is the TikTok generation. And when you think about when we think about reaching really truly young people in digital spaces, it's Gen Z who is turning away from Facebook and from YouTube and pivoting over towards TikTok. And perhaps as a follow-up, Rob, you may consider even doing an entire seminar on TikTok. I'd be curious to learn from some real experts on this topic. But the rise of TikTok is a challenge for church community.
I know Hermes made a comment there when you were talking about the boomers and where have the boomers gone.
Mm-hmm.
And she talks about how they're still kind of afraid of infection. And I wonder too how much of the just life situation has changed for boomers and for seniors, where like their personal health has deteriorated, or they're taking on more of a caregiver role now for a spouse. And a lot of boomers are grandparents who have had to take on a role of childcare, right? So that count for some of the kind of disappearance of the boomers.
Very well could be. I wish this survey would have accounted for the silent generation and those born up until 1945 as well, because it starts with those born after 1946. Those which would be they would be 77 years old today. There is a gap that I see at my church on Sunday morning where we have the very we have those who are probably born circa 1935 to 1940 who are sitting next to those who were born in 1989. And so, yeah, there very well could be a caregiver dimension to this. I wish this Barna Group data would have included a wider generational sampling in its survey. It would have been interesting to see when you add another generation past the boomers, what does that data look like?
Yeah, and Gloria makes an interesting point too. She talks about her church here in St. John's, St. James United Church, and how they have a designated lay minister, which is a term within their tradition, who does an online contemporary service. So it's specifically designed for online, and the attendance numbers at that have been fairly consistent, but they're like kind of hybrid offering of church services, traditional church services just being live streamed. That attendance has been low throughout. So I think there's something in there about something that's specifically designed for an online audience. And I don't know, you probably get into that a bit more like in the content creation and curation, but I thought that was an interesting point.
Oh yeah, and that is a great segue, Rob, into the next section on hybrid ministry models, where we'll talk about some of this. I just want to see if there's any other questions on the previous section before we jump into that.
Well, Don makes a point there. I wonder if Canada's online attendance is greater because our churches had stricter lockdowns than the US.
Yeah, it very well could be. And I've had some conversations with pastors in New Zealand, and they have very high, continue to have very high online attendance. New Zealand, of course, had a zero COVID policy for much longer than the United States, and they continue to see elevated levels of digital church attendance as a result. Well, let's shift the conversation then into some different models of hybrid or digital ministry. And again, the reason why we think about these models is to consider what makes what seems to be the fit given the mission, vision, and particulars of your ministry context. And in this segment, I'm going to present 5 or 6 different models. It's not my intention to try to convince you that one is necessarily better or more advantageous than the others, rather to present them for the opportunities they afford and some of the limitations that they might present. So first of all, let's talk about this topic of fully online ministry. And this is a question that tends to come up on these sessions. What is the likelihood that that church community will become entirely virtual? And both the Episcopal and the Lutheran churches have some well-funded and thoughtful experiments that are happening in the metaverse right now. This is a screenshot of an Episcopal startup in the metaverse, as well as All Places Together, which is a ELCA church community here in the States, pastored by Colleen Montgomery, and she gathers her church community around podcasts, Instagram, and in TikTok content as well. So there are some experiments into fully online church online ministry. Typically, what they try or what they attempt to bring together is a like-minded affinity group that gathers to pray and read the scriptures and worship on popular digital platforms like Instagram and TikTok. One of the challenges with a fully online ministry, to say nothing of the sacraments or the embodied aspect of Christian liturgy, is how difficult it is to convene any stable digital community. Digital communities gather around highly niche specific interests, which is why when you look at Reddit, the reason why Reddit is one of the most popular platforms on the internet is that it's divided into extremely specific subreddits or threads that get into very specific niche interests. The church doesn't do niche interests particularly consistently. That, you know, when you look at a church, it's a wide sampling that's coming together for a variety of reasons. Our prayers are broad and lift up many different causes or concerns, and the scriptures can be interpreted through many different lenses. So there's some tension between the niche nature of online community. The more niche, the more stable the community tends to become, and what is, I think, the big tent nature of many Christian traditions. So I don't know that fully online ministry will ever fade or as something that the church is interested in. And I think it's worthwhile putting some investment at a denominational or adjudicatory level into how church might function through the metaverse. But I'm somewhat skeptical that an all online community will ever be more than an experiment as to what church community could be. Now, if we think about fully online, perhaps a step closer towards analog plus digital together is the idea of fully hybrid. And a fully hybrid church community is one that is the combination of online and offline participation. And what I mean by that is if you're a hybrid ministry, it's not just providing an ability to live stream a video of something that's happening elsewhere, but affords opportunities for liturgy as the work of the people to happen in multiple different places. This could be seen through the use of a virtual lector or prayer petitions that are surfaced through YouTube chat or text message. The advantage of the fully hybrid model is that it is highly inclusive. And I think it makes an important theological statement about how God can be accessed both through analog and digital spaces. Fully hybrid ministry, by the way, is not necessarily dependent on a live stream. A recorded online service creates opportunities for digital participation. And if you have that digital participation happening, then you're really thinking about that liturgy or that work of the people. The challenge of hybrid or a fully hybrid ministry is that it's logistically quite difficult. This is one of the churches that's doing this quite well. This is the Riverside Church in New York. The Riverside Church is pastored by one of the pastors, one of the clergy of the Riverside Church is Jim Keat. It's one of the preeminent thought leaders and just idea generators on digital ministry. But what you'll see when you tune in to YouTube for the Riverside Church is a very active chat experience, as well as contributions that are stitched in from contributors and worship leaders who are not in the sanctuary in Manhattan. And this does a couple of things for the Riverside Church. First, it gets a lot of people involved in the dialogue. The chat is very active, it's very engaged, there's prayer petitions, there's reactions to the sermon. It's really quite interesting to follow one of their Sundays. And it opens the possibility of hearing different voices from the pulpit or different prayer petitions than what you might hear locally. Still, though, when we think about fully hybrid ministry, the logistical challenges are significant. It requires thoughtful use of film editing software that can splice in those video contributions happening outside of the sanctuary, and it requires the resource of curating a chat experience. And if you just think through the typical worship experience for a second, most who are tuning into worship probably don't even see the chat because they're streaming it to a television or they're watching it full screen on a phone or full screen on an iPad. And if you're doing that on YouTube, you actually minimize the chat in the process. So one of the questions I tend to get on these is how do we have a more engaged chat during our online worship? And I'm not sure that the technology we use to stream worship is necessarily all that conducive to online chat. So it is a challenge. All right, model number 3 then, if we've talked about all online, fully hybrid, is the live stream model. And the live stream model is really the idea of putting the camera in the front row. So that worship attendance online is a high quality production experience. It attracts viewers. It can be effective for the purposes of teaching. A lot of evangelical, Protestant evangelical communities are invested in a high quality live stream experience. The limitation of the live stream is that it doesn't afford many opportunities for participation. And when you don't have that participation, it's sometimes difficult to cultivate conversation or really intentional forms of community. Still, though, a high quality live stream experience can serve as an easy on-ramp to the life of a community. And many who have joined new church communities during the last 3 years have done so because of what they first encountered through a live stream. This is an example of a church a friend of mine is the pastor at. It's Blackhawk Church. It's an evangelical congregation here in Madison, where their use of lighting and sounds and slides and images is highly produced and polished and I think quite effective. Still, if I'm watching this from home, there's no chance for me to let my voice be heard or for me to weigh in or contribute concerns for prayers. And so it too, like all of these models, presents some limitations and challenges. And if the live stream model presents an opportunity, the live stream that is high tech and highly resourced, the live stream light model is perhaps one that more of our churches might actually be practicing, which is the topic of online, but in the back row. This might be where you post a Mevo streaming camera or an iPad on a tripod somewhere near the back of the sanctuary, and you click a button and you set it and forget it. This model is low effort. It leaves perhaps the friction point is that the digital production quality leaves something to be desired. However, there are 2 advantages to having a low effort live stream. The first is that it's authentic. It shows that you're not a Hollywood movie producer, you're a local congregation. And I think that's an important message when we're in this age of TikTok and the experience of high quality entertainment. But the other is that it does show that the church is not an exclusively online endeavor, but is in fact a community that's gathered in real physical space. And implicitly, that opens an invitation to come and join the worship service that's taking place within the sanctuary. There's one more model that is starting to emerge in this conversation on digital ministry, which is the more content-driven model. And in a content-driven digital ministry, you'll prioritize digital storytelling over streaming. What that might look like is the sermon that's preached maybe from the offline sanctuary on the Sunday is extended into a conversation that continues through videos, blogs, and podcasts over the course of the week. A content-driven digital ministry says, we might do a very low effort live stream or even no live stream at all. Or if we don't have Wi-Fi, we're not going to worry about it. But we're still going to create opportunities to go deeper into the themes of the scriptures, the liturgies, and the preaching Monday through Saturday in a way that builds up the community and nourishes them with the word as they go into their weekly vocations. This is the stress experiment that we're trying to run at Good Shepherd here in Madison, where we're just now figuring out what's the right blend of digital content to follow up a sermon with. Here's us taping a recent podcast episode. We've done this 5 or 6 times, and we're trying to figure out what's the right blend of blogs and videos and podcasts. What's the right cadence to distribute all of this content? Do we do this every week? Do we do this a few times each year? All of these are questions that we're actively processing. But what this looks like is a page on our website with content that's also distributed through our various feeds, including our podcast feed and our email newsletter. That takes what was lifted up through prayer and preaching and adds another lens to it that can be accessed throughout the week. One more example here, Community Lutheran Las Vegas is one of many churches that has done a fireside chat type program where every Tuesday their pastoral team will sit down and think through some of the themes from the scriptures and preaching and what they might suggest about the week ahead. And a lot of churches have adopted this type of fireside chat approach or the idea of the podcast as being an expression of digital ministry that doesn't involve a very high-tech presence on Sundays. All of these then represent the full spectrum, the full continuum of online ministry models, from full online to full offline and everything in between. There's not necessarily one model that's more advantageous or less advantageous than the other, though I would hope that most ministries would at least have the curiosity to explore different models that are digitally inclusive and not go completely offline. Though even the completely offline model has a time and a place in today's church. So I've noticed a few questions in the chat scrolling by during this last segment. Rob, anything you want to lift up here?
I'd like for Dawn Leger, who's going to be one of our speakers this afternoon, to speak, because she has a response to some of the things you said about exclusively online community. So Dawn, I don't know if you want to go ahead.
Thanks, Rob. Before this starts to sound like a gossip session, all I said was, I hope he's going to attend my talk this afternoon, which I hear you can't, so that's okay. It just mostly to introduce myself. I'm the pastor of a fully online church, and
right.
We have been around for 2 years, and we continue to grow and evolve. And so, yeah, we're called Harbor Online Community, onlineharbor.org, and would love to talk to you more about it, because we kind of don't know what we're doing, and but we also do. And I think, as you say, it's not for everyone, but we're finding it's actually for more people than we thought it was. So yeah, that was just my comment.
Thanks for sharing. If you don't mind, do you mind if I'm going to pull up your website here, and I'll show you one thing I really think is kind of cool about what you're doing. Belonging together in God's kingdom, post-evangelical and inclusive, dialogical. You've got a few attributes here, and I don't really know much about about this community, but you've got a few attributes here that really define who you are and what you're about. And if we think about like what types of communities are likely to be stable in a post-pandemic digital reality, then I think we have to think about that level of specificity, which I see here, and also the word vulnerable. So the kudos on being willing to take up the experiment, and I would love to hear how this is going for you. I'm always looking for more examples because I like to kind of tune into what these congregations are doing. And I also pulled up your Instagram page. excellent examples here of one, different types of Instagram content, but I love the what's on your website is certainly reflected on what's shared through social media. Thanks so much for sharing.
If I could just add one thing about the specificity, which I totally agree with. What's interesting is that term post-evangelical, we're finding, is starting to become a stumbling block, and also that it's actually, we're hearing from people from a lot of different denominations and Christian experiences. So we're actually looking at dropping that descriptor, because that's not quite who our community is anymore, which is kind of interesting. That we've been kind of following this evolution, and as y'all can see, we don't have a lot of followers, but we probably need to do more on that front, but we're doing pretty good.
Well, and the number that I think with all forms of digital community, we're a church where 2 or 3 are gathered, and God is amongst us, and it matters a lot less the quantity of followers and more of the depth of conversation that's taking place across that community.
Yeah, I think a lot of the comments and conversation in the chat there, Ryan, were focusing on choice, like, so people like online better than they like in person, or they like in person more than they like online. But I think one thing you have to consider that I think comes out in Don's community of Harbor Online is, do people experience our churches as safe places, welcoming places?
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say, and I don't want to generalize, but I would say for a lot of people, they don't. And so the online option might be a safer space for people kind of to dip their toe in the water to see if church is something that I might be interested in. And then there's a whole segment of people too, and I think Don probably deals a lot with these people who have been hurt by the church and rejected by the church. And so, coming into a physical building with people that they've experienced to be judgmental and mean and hurtful and even hateful, online is a good alternative for some of those people.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think that's the greatest gift of digital ministry is it creates that easy entry point to the life of a worshiping community that was previously difficult to establish. Even thinking about just the psychological baggage that can come with walking into a church building, but there's also physical limitations like big steps, narrow aisles. There's all kinds of attributes of church life that are going to be at times exclusive, and digital in many ways creates a welcome where previously there was not one. I saw Allison had a hand raised.
Yeah, I was just this is all very new to me. I haven't taken Rob's course. But I think these different models are what's really interesting to me, because I was only familiar with the live stream, and in many ways I kind of fit this sort of millennial Gen Xer thing, because I have my faith community, I don't have one locally, so it's only live stream that I attend, but I like having like a real in-person connection. So I attend like a different faith community in person locally, but like I'm always looking for like this content driven stuff, because part of the problem for me with the live streaming is there's just no way for me to feel connected to the community. And I think that's like not as a clergy, but as a parishioner or a community member, that's my big struggle, is how do I find a way to actually engage with an online community when I don't have one locally?
It's a great question. The benefit of digital content is it creates a rallying point for conversations. in a way sometimes that a 1 hour live stream doesn't afford. And so when we look at this content driven model, when we create blog posts, podcasts, artifacts of digital media that are then used to continue a conversation through social media or through Discord or chat applications or through text message, it gives us an opportunity to live more into that conversational spirit of community, which is a real, I think, advantage of lower tech, lower media budget churches, because as you see with TikTok, entertainment media is not always conversational, but authentic church-based content, despite some of the blemishes we may have in the production quality, perhaps lends itself more naturally towards conversation and dialogue. And Dawn's community had dialogical written as a core attribute. Dawn, I'm wondering if you want to respond to that. Like, how do you actually convene dialogue and create a conversation?
So we have a few ways. We have our Thursday gathering, which is our main way of connecting to one another. And so that dialogical refers more to how we do our teaching, which is less sermon based, which is not based so much on a sermon as a shared teaching, and then more discussion and kind of pulling wisdom from the group. But we also I'm going to tell a little bit about this afternoon, but just briefly, we have an online platform where a lot of our conversation is building and growing. We also do a brunch on Wednesdays, which is just an hour of just like chatting and conversation. So there are various ways to do that. It's just a matter of, I think, as Ryan's been showing so clearly, like what kind of online ministry is a church able to do, and then picking the tools to help you do that. But there are definitely tools and ways of doing
that. I talked to a pastor named DJ Soto, who has become kind of a famous example of evangelical digital church community, because he started a church called the VR Church, which exists exclusively in virtual reality. You actually have to put on the goggles to join their worship services. And his community exists through gatherings in VR, and also through a Discord, which is a free chat application. I know of other churches that convene conversations on WhatsApp, and Discord and WhatsApp seem to be additional spaces where that type of community might be found. Certainly, YouTube is limiting in the chat and dialogue that can be had on the platform. In every platform is going to have advantages and limitations with regard to that dialogue. I wanted to share a couple of more ideas on this topic, and then we'll think about what comes next with our time together. If you plot all of these models out onto a matrix of complexity versus common versus uncommon, what you'll find is that by far the most common form of ministry model is this idea of the live stream light, the back row seat for digital community. The least common model is this content-driven digital ministry, where there's a lot less emphasis on live streaming on Sundays and more that's put in towards content. And the most complex model that we have is that fully hybrid model I showed you with the Riverside Church, perhaps because it's so complex. But I think it's helpful to understand these dimensions of complexity versus commonality, because the more common the example, the more common the model, the more examples you'll have to draw from as you can consider how it fits within your context. And the more complex the model, the more resources you'll have to allocate towards maintaining that model over time. The last thing I want to say on different models is that when we think about hybrid ministry, I actually think we do ourselves a disservice when we think about this as online plus offline, even though this is often conventionally thought of as the definition of hybrid ministry. And the reason for that is because when we think about hybrid ministry as online plus offline, what we've done is we've doubled our to-do list every week. And so rather than thinking about this as online plus offline, I think a better way to visualize this is through the lens of inviting and equipping. And not that you can't invite in analog spaces or equip through digital spaces, but when we think about what digital media allows us to do really well is to extend a wide-reaching invitation to the life of worshiping communities in a way that wouldn't have been possible in analog space. And similarly, when we think about what analog or face-to-face spaces are really great at, equipping folks for living the life of faith, for building relationships and cultivating conversations that lead towards lives of service. Again, that's not to say that can't be done digitally, but it's an affordance of analog community that it does that well. So when we think about what we're going to bring in from the digital world and what we're going to bring in from the analog world to determine our digital ministry model, I encourage you to think about what are the ways this community will invite and what are the ways this community will equip. And oftentimes when we think about hybrid or digital through those lenses, we can make our hybrid ministry efforts both purposeful and also sustainable. All right, so here and also in the chat, basically, what is the model that best describes your ministry, and what are some of the responses to that model?
Well, the small group that we had was almost one extreme to the other, because parish that I used to attend has more of the live stream, well, without the evangelical piece, but it's more of a live stream model where there is interaction with the congregation online through Facebook Live. And then the other attendee in our little room was virtually no tech. So we've had both, and the resource requirements is almost too demanding, and theological commitments. I mean, we've got fewer and fewer clergy. That's more of a challenge than ever before.
Thanks, Ian. Anyone else care to share what you discussed in breakouts? It doesn't even have to respond to any of these questions, but any reactions to these models?
I think our breakout session, we used Queens College as the model because and the advantage would be the content-driven ministry. But the challenge we're thinking about or the one I shared was more about from a young adult perspective. I'm 23, and most of my people my age have short attention span. So even though we're looking for something quality to hold on to, we're talking about the podcast, but is more about how can we, like, when in your charts there, you showed Netflix and you showed TikTok. It's more about how can we progress the learning and keep the interest of young adults like myself to knowing more and exploring more, either through the podcast or some interactions that actually draw our attention, And there's also, like, I feel it's different times of the day as well, like when, like, different hours of the day when it's less active and when, like, downtimes and all that. So it's more, I think there's a lot more explorations around that idea with those questions too.
The idea of attention span is an interesting one, because on the one hand you have TikTok, but on the other hand you have podcasts. And the most popular podcasts are daily shows that are 2 to 3 hours plus in length, listened to by audiences in the millions. And so when you think about the idea of digital content, there's on the one hand an opportunity to go really deep into topics of interest to the community. And on the other hand, the TikTok trend pulls us towards very short form, entertaining bites of content. So there's a tension there. What I think creates the opportunity to go deeper into the content is relationship and trust. And people are going to forgive low quality production values and engage more around content where there's a precedent of relationality where you know the community who's creating, sharing, or contributing to the content. Is it Kelechi? Is that how you pronounce your name?
Yeah, Kelechi.
Kelechi, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives.
Thank you.
Let me just share a few thoughts on content. I said we'd talk a little bit about content, and I want to share a few trends in this space. When we think about content, I just want to share a few things about why this matters. First of all, the relevance and original content that your congregation comes up with determines the visibility of your ministry in a digital age. All search technology, all social technology looks at figuring out how to rank content based on what's most relevant and original. And so when we share content, we're not just contributing to a conversation, but we're achieving the tactical goal of just making our ministry visible. Second, digital content can be repackaged. You think about digital content best when you think about it as a set of Legos. When you write a blog post, when you take your sermon and you convert it into a short form video, what you're doing is you're adding another Lego to the toolkit. And the best content creators aren't always writing or editing or recording new things, but they're looking at what they've already done and repurposing it or repackaging it. That's why when you look at a podcast feed for regular podcast episodes that are doing 4 or 5 episodes a week, a lot of those episodes are sharing what they did 2 years ago and resurfacing it for new visibility. There's also the idea that online content functions as an invitation to a conversation. So when we think about a live stream experience, it's often a one-way broadcast, but digital content creates this networked mode where you can exchange ideas and react to something along with a community. That then brings up the question of what should be curated and what should be created. And my argument would be that as people involved with the work of the church, most of what we are here to do is to curate rather than create. Most of what we have access to in the church is shared source material, lectionary readings, prayers, excerpts from the Book of Common Prayer. And that's an interesting mode for digital content, because what we seek to do with content curation, quoting a tweet, sharing a post on Facebook, sharing a link to a podcast, is to contextualize it into something that's happening within the life of our community. It doesn't mean you'll never create those things from scratch. Specifically, when you want to lift up stories or perspectives that are unique to your community, content creation is indeed a powerful tool. But most of these topics that we're thinking about in the church have some type of source material that we can access elsewhere and repackage it. So content curation, whether it's through sermon sources, sermon audio that's published in a podcast feed, or a confirmation lesson that's turned into an Instagram reel video, or prayers of the people that are converted into social media posts. The idea of curation is perhaps the top idea that's going to get digital ministry to a point of sustainability in a post-lockdown church. I'll just share a couple of examples in the slides that I send out after today's presentation, including an Instagram page and a YouTube channel that do this work of curating really, I think, is especially well. And then I will also share, as part of the follow-up, some resources for congregations that are looking to either get in the habit of content creation or curation. But the work of curation is the work of being a theological digital librarian. And the research skills that Queen's College, I'm sure, will equip you with are the same skills and filters you can apply when looking at digital content pertaining to the life of faith. I think those skills will serve us all well as we remix and repackage and contextualize in the particulars of a ministry context. So noting that we have a few minutes left, let me share a few resources and then provide some space here for questions and answers. First of all, there is a lot to learn about this topic. We are just at the start of the church's digital reformation. And I think it's useful at this jumping off point to be voracious readers on this topic, both the critiques and also the celebrations of what's happening digitally. And if you're looking for a couple of thoughtful critiques of digital ministry, the reason you should be looking for those critiques is because they present the boundaries or borders of where digital ministry can go and perhaps can't go. J.Y. Kim is a pastor in Silicon Valley who has seen the good and oftentimes very ugly side of the digital world. And his book, Analog Church, is an excellent exploration of what limitations are found in digital communities. Andy Root, who's a professor and theologian at Luther Seminary, has written extensively on this topic. His latest book, The Church After Innovation, calls into question almost everything I have said during our time together. So read Andy's work, and you'll soon realize that everything I told you was utter nonsense, and you should probably just ignore all of it. And then if you want a really good look at what is great about digital ministry, read the work of Keith Anderson, specifically his books, The Digital Cathedral, which is about the model of ministry in the digital age, as well as his book, Click to Save, which is more of a field guide to different digital ministry tools. And here's a screenshot of Keith's book, Click to Save Reboot. The other book that I'll highlight here is Deanna Thompson's The Virtual Body of Christ in a Suffering World. Deanna is a professor at St. Olaf College in Minnesota. And the reason I highlight this book is because it is a fantastic conversation piece for vestries, councils, boards, and congregations that are exploring what can and can't be done in digital. And if you have questions from vestry members or congregation members who are saying, can't we just go back online? Why are we letting people stay home? The Virtual Body of Christ is an excellent way to engage that conversation thoughtfully and without dismissing those concerns. I just want to share a couple of things. Contact me if you have any questions. If you want to follow up this conversation, I'll put my email address in the chat. Also, ryanpanzer.com has some blog posts and a newsletter you can subscribe to. But please send me your questions, and would love to continue this dialogue after we've wrapped up our time together. But I've probably said enough here. I want to see what questions the group has before we head to lunch.
Ryan, I just wanted to speak to Andy Root's book. I just finished reading that book recently. It is an excellent book, but I don't think he would disagree with you, but he certainly cautions us that the obsession with innovation, which often puts an overemphasis on maybe creativity, is often rooted in capitalism and not so much in the gospel. And I think that's a fair critique from him. Right?
I'll post the link to Andy and I did a podcast together through Luther Seminary, and episode 59, Andrew Root, and episode 60 is me. We did the same Zoom call. We got to do some dialogue with each other. So I just posted that to the chat if you want to learn more about Andy's work. Allison has a hand up.
Yeah, I was just when you were talking about creation versus curation, I was thinking about what a lot of my peers watch, which is like creators responding to creators. And I wondered if there's anything going on in digital ministry that combines created content with curated content. So like they take something that's already there and then respond to it in their own way.
Yeah, that's I've also heard it phrased as remix culture. And I had a professor at Luther Seminary that actually juxtaposed some Tupac lyrics with some selections from the Old Testament that quote one another. And it was an amazing lecture. But what we're entering, digital creation, digital content creation is frequently a response to some other form of digital, which is why when you do the work of taking your sermon manuscript and creating social posts or blog posts from it, you're giving yourself more Lego blocks to participate in that work. The most prolific content creators don't write new blog posts or create new videos every day. They simply think about what they've already recorded, how has their context changed since they recorded it, and how might they adapt what they did originally to fit the particulars of a changed context, whether that's news headlines, changes in society, issues a particular ministry is working through. All of these represent context shifts, and all of our content can be reevaluated given those changes. Kelechi, saw your hand was up.
Yes. I apologize. My camera was not on. I thought it was on. This is more like a futuristic question now. From your studies, what would you say, Ryan, is looking at the metaverse, looking at what Elon Musk is doing, Neuralink, looking at everything happening with social media and everything you've researched from your studies, where would you say, from someone my age, I'm 23, what would you say is the future of digital media in the church, its influences, and most likely, how are we gonna make the metaverse not 70% of the church interactions we're gonna have in the future? Like, from what you've done your research, what do you say is gonna, where do you see this going?
Yeah, I'll just say two quick things. So first of all, I think you're going to see in some circles a reaction to increased digital forms of communication and community that will increase our thirst for face-to-face forms of connection and hospitality. That's why I think retreat centers, camping ministries are uniquely positioned for this moment, because even though our week to week may become more digitally focused, we'll have more and more hunger to gather in analog spaces like our summer camps, where there's hardly any Wi-Fi signal to be found. And then just very tactically, I think some of the open AI technologies like ChatGPT will probably not be as big of a transformative force in terms of our communities, but they may make our lives easier from the standpoint of doing good communication, curating, finding what's out there, and creating digital content. So I'm less worried about ChatGPT than some in the church have suggested. There's somebody I like to follow, Cal Newport, who's a computer scientist at Georgetown, just wrote a great New Yorker piece about ChatGPT, kind of how it works and why he's not as concerned about it as others seem to be. I'm ultimately someone who's pretty optimistic about where technology is taking us and what it means for the church. I saw Rob. I know we're past time here. I saw one other hand up.
That was mine. I took it down again, actually.
Okay.
Because Kelechi kind of touched on what I was going to speak on, but I want to thank you for offering your wealth of information about digital tech today. It was wonderful. Thanks.
Thanks for participating in the conversation.
And Ryan, there's a comment there from question from Bill. Has anyone noticed that the increased online usage has eroded our skills of in-person contact?
I think my wife, who's a high school science teacher, would certainly suggest that it has. And again, that reaction of wanting that in-person connection, we will see that, and it will be in tension with more of our day-to-day experiences being online, and also a strong desire to get together in person. That's why retreats will become more powerful and useful, and summer camps will become more of a gift to our church than ever before. I hope so, anyway.
And Bill posted another question there, and the answer, Bill, is maybe we'll have to create another space where we can talk about the things that are working and not working. And it might be a little bit more of an informal thing, but maybe I'll offer that space to the people who have registered for this. We could have a little follow-up chat, because there was some comments about needing more time to talk about the things that were working in particular context, but we're kind of too limited in time to be able to really get into that today. But I can certainly host another Zoom chat where we can talk about some of those things and even share some resources and, you know, what works and what doesn't work, those kinds of stories with each other too.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for participating in this dialogue today, and acknowledge and lift up the work you're doing to lead us into the church's new digital moments. I've so much enjoyed our time together. Please send me your questions, your comments, your reactions, your pushback, and blessings to all of you as you continue to lead the way.
Thanks, Ryan. Hey, look.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Take care.